Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to answer the latest round of listener questions for June of 2026. I've said it probably 27 times since we have been recording this podcast, but I can't believe we're already halfway through the year of 2026. It's just already flying by.
It just seems to go so fast that we're 300 episodes. It's incredible.
Yeah. And before we hit record, we were talking about the different questions that we're getting asked. And there's definitely some different ones here that I've not dealt with before, and a couple of more complicated questions, I will say, and then very common questions. And those common questions are often answered via education, right? So it's things like joining the National Association of Royalty Owners and sitting through some of the webinars and the in-person conventions and hearing the basics around, estate planning and, how do you transfer interest, and then learning about the different types of interest, whether that's in, again, a narrow course or through my course, Mineral Management Basics, where I'd walk through those things. And we'll talk about some of those tips for those folks that have those very common things you deal with. It's like death and taxes. Unfortunately, those things are things you can't get away from. And it's so you have to plan ahead and know and prepare for those events. And so we'll talk about how to do that as well. But on a little bit of a brighter note, kind of an interesting one. And this was from an in-person question that we got actually at last year's National Association of Royalty Owners convention, where Justin and I recorded a live listener Q&A episode. And Stephen was in the audience and he asked a question. You want to talk about his question, and then we'll talk about his response.
This is a somewhat common question that you get in different flavors, but the answer can be very specific to your situation. So Stephen asked, I was an audience member inquiring about the pooling versus allocation calculations in Texas. You mentioned there being a precedence for the Texas Railroad Commission making oil companies honor the paperwork filed in regards to the NRI calculated. Can you point me in the right direction to trying to find such a precedent, or is this more of a straightforward situation I should file a hearing with the Texas Railroad Commission with? Matt, the pooling versus allocation, that right there, I think, is a buzzword that tells you, okay, this could get a bit technical.
Yeah, it can get very technical. And fortunately, we have an episode that we break that down for you and talk about the difference between allocation wells and pooling. And that is episode 304. And so we talk about this kind of very unique situation that really only exists in Texas, because Texas does not have forced pooling. In other words, when an operator goes to drill a well, they need to combine together different mineral tracts. And in other states, they do that through the whole pooling process. So they would file for a pooling order. And so that whole application process and review process in other states requires they have leased a certain percentage of mineral owners in that designated unit. And then for the others that they couldn't get a hold of or that didn't agree to a lease, they go through this process of statutory pooling and they get a certain royalty rate. And then they eventually, if they're forced pooled, oftentimes back into their full non-operated working interest in that well, which is kind of a unique scenario. But Texas is different, of course, with many things. And so Texas has a way to get around that because there's no forced pooling. Operators need to combine those different mineral tracts together. And oftentimes, if they can't get consent through a production sharing agreement or through a pooled unit, they have a mechanism called an allocation well. And basically what that allows them to do is to allocate production to the individual mineral owners based on how much of the wellbore goes through their unit or their individual mineral tract. And so it's very specific. It can get complicated as to how you would calculate your decimal interest in those wells. And what Stephen's situation is, and it's very fact specific, like Justin mentioned, sometimes a pooled unit is a better option for you than an allocation well. In fact, I was helping a client recently with answering that question and looking at those two different scenarios. And they wanted to know, should they sign this ratification document, and would that be beneficial to them from the decimal interest? And it really, in some cases, the answer is yes. The pooled unit's going to give you a higher NRI or net revenue interest in that well. And in some cases, the allocation well is going to give you the higher decimal interest in that well. So it's very much depends on the specifics of every well in that unit. Sometimes some wells can be better than others in terms of that trade-off. But in Stephen's case, the operator had, I think, presented it as, if I remember correctly, an allocation well, and then they later said that it was a pooled unit. And so they changed calculation of the decimal interest, and it was not advantageous to Stephen in that case. And in fact, he had a little bit lower decimal interest in those wells because of that change. And so he wanted to know, okay, what authority do they have to do that? So the reason that they filed for the allocation well is likely because they didn't have enough of the mineral owners that had agreed to pool their interests together. And so were going down the path of the allocation well. It's possible that then they found and they got a hold of those additional folks, and they were able to get them to ratify the pooling. And so they changed it. But in general, they can't just do that on a whim without getting the required approvals. And the amendment for the permit is a different situation. So the Railroad Commission doesn't have the legal authority to change how royalties are calculated. They don't decide contractual rights or authority of the operator. They just, if the requirements have been met and the operator has submitted all the required documents, they'll issue the permit accordingly. So it's really more, I think, of a legal question as to what the operator did after that original permit. And to form a valid pooled unit, they have to have pooling authority under every lease. And that's explicit usually. And they have to have the right paperwork filed with the Railroad Commission. And then they have to record a pooling declaration with the county. And so they can't just amend the permit and decide later to do that without having those things in place. So as long as the operator did those things and satisfied those requirements, then I think, they have the authority to then change the calculation of how that well is allocated, how the production is allocated. There's a couple of legal decisions about that. One was fairly recently. It was Opiella versus Railroad Commission of Texas. And basically it said that they can't just make that change without having the actual ratification, explicit ratification, and recorded in the county records from those mineral owners. So they can't just piece that together, even if they have the leases that allow for pooling. They can't just flip it to a production sharing agreement well without getting explicit approval from those and ratification of that PSA from those affected mineral owners. So ultimately, whatever they were able to do, and you should be able to look in the county records to see if they did meet those requirements. Certainly if they didn't, then that would be a good place to get an attorney to help you review that and see if you have any recourse. And I would say probably either direction, I would definitely get help from an attorney to help review all of the division order, the permit amendments, the well designation, all the stuff in the county records, your lease, to make sure that it actually would allow for the pooling. Because ultimately that, it's a legal decision rather than a regulatory decision as to if they could switch that. But, in general, I will say that if they file the paperwork in the counties and, they don't have the designated ratifications and they don't have the pooled unit formed, then they have to do the allocation well route, or vice versa. If they do have those things in place, then they can calculate the net revenue interest based on the pooling. So, but they can't just decide to switch it without having those other things in place. So ultimately, your situation is a very complicated legal question, I think, Stephen. So, highly recommend getting help from a qualified attorney to help you navigate that. So good luck.
Yep. One of the best things you can do if you are going to go seek legal counsel on this is have your documents in order. That's what they're going to want to see to be able to really advise you properly, and have copies of those paperwork. The scenario happens too often when we reach out to attorneys and we're asking them to advise on something. But if we don't have the legal documents for them to review, it puts them in a precarious situation to give you any sort of advice without actually reading those documents. All right, Matt, our next one here is from Linda. And Linda says that she had learned about missing money in 2017, and it took a long time to get any information. Her mother had passed away in 1995. She sent her heir information to the Texas Comptroller Unclaimed Property. They didn't ask for any information and didn't confirm that they'd received it. She applied again in 2025 and still didn't have any correspondence. And she's been having a difficult battle since 95 to try to get these assets transferred. And Matt, we hear this all too often. And as unfortunate as it is, I think quite often it goes back to the mineral owner not quite understanding what documents are needed for the transfer of title. And then also polite persistence. I'm sure the Texas Comptroller Unclaimed Property Office gets lots of inquiries every day.
Oh my, I can only imagine the number of emails and phone calls they get. So fortunately, their website is pretty good. And I believe when you identify those properties, you can select them and file a claim, and it'll put a form together for you that actually lists the properties and like in the format that where the people that work for the comptroller's office can take that information and know which property is being requested. So it might be something related to what you filed. And I would say anytime you have these types of requests that you send in, don't send the originals of anything. Always make copies, have everything together. So if it gets lost in the mail, because it's very possible that they never got it. So if you mailed it to them, it's possible that it was lost, or maybe that is the situation where you need to reprint out or recopy everything and send it to them again until you get a confirmation that they received it. And I wouldn't expect very fast response. My discussions with other mineral owners that have gone through this process is it takes a very long time. And I think a lot of it's just the volume of requests that they get and the number of properties that missing money or unclaimed property that's out there that they are having to manage. So I wouldn't think it's, so she mentions corruption and, running out of time to try to protect your family inheritance. And I'd say it's unlikely that there's corruption causing these delays. I think it's probably more, I wouldn't say incompetence, but sometimes you go to the DMV and you scratch your head at like how these people are still gainfully employed. And I think some of that may be that people aren't incentivized to work quickly. And I think it's probably just more a matter of the incentives that are in place for the employees there. And it's like they don't need to, respond quickly. They're still going to get a paycheck and, it's not going to benefit them. It's just going to add stress. So they're like, well, I'm just going to go through and keep doing what I'm doing. So I would just be persistent, like Justin said. And the good thing is with these, when funds are escheated to the state, for example, any royalty payments that were owed to your past relatives, that they couldn't pay them, it gets handed over to the state by law. They have to do that within a certain period of time. And then the state has to administer it. And it's in there in perpetuity. It's not going to expire or go away. And so, in general, to my knowledge, and I guess I could be wrong, but I've never heard of that being an issue. And so you have time to do things properly and to take your time and get all the paperwork in order. And sometimes that means, like Justin said, having the paperwork, like going through probate to show that you're a rightful heir and to have that deed that shows that you're the current owner and that you inherited it from your mother. And then, things like death certificates and all of those kinds of things need to be organized and sent in. And they provide a list of all the things you need to provide in order to claim any unclaimed property that's out there. So, good luck, Linda. I hope that you were able to get a response from the comptroller by now. If not, I would just be persistent. And again, just send in that information again if it didn't get received. And then as much as you can do online and get like a confirmation number and things like that, that's also good because that leaves a trail that shows that you submitted it versus sending it in normal U.S. Postal Service and hoping that it gets there. So good luck.
And Matt, I think this highlights a really common thing that you hear when it comes to the unclaimed property. Unclaimed property is where operators, others, cheat the funds that are collected, which they can't pay out to whomever. However, it is not going to transfer the title of your property. I've heard this confusion before where they thought, okay, I'm going to go through the comptroller and this is a mineral and oil and gas property, and then they're going to give me back the deed. No, that's certainly not the case. And there is title work to do to get those assets transferred to you, Linda. Though the money, if they were unable to find the owner of the money at the time, that might have been cheated to the Texas comptroller. Doesn't mean that you don't need to do title work. And that might be really where your focus is better at rather than the bit of income that was transferred to the comptroller.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, it needs to be done one way or the other, potentially to claim those past royalties, but then certainly for future royalties as well.
Our next one here from Jonathan. This is a really interesting question, Matt, and good to see Asheville, Alabama here. I haven't thought about Asheville in a long time. So Jonathan says, thank you for doing your excellent podcast. I realize the thrust of the show is oil and gas, but I was hoping you may have some info that could help. First, I inherited 940 acres of mineral rights near Asheville, Alabama, and I'm fairly certain the rights are above a large shell deposit, part of the Big Canoe area. I'm researching what to do with that through your resources. Second, I inherited land with taphole clay on it, and I own the mineral rights. Do you guys have an example document to show how to put information needed together to approach an investment group about buying the land with clay and mineral rights? I'm curious to know what level of fidelity to pursue that is acceptable for testing of cores to show what is on the property, how deep to take samples, metrics, all that fun stuff. Would it behoove me to start a mining company and get city approvals first? Also wondering the best, least expensive way to assess the ground to show what is there. Have some ideas, but would love to hear your thoughts. Matt, a lot of questions in that, but really interesting questions.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I've never dealt with taphole clay, and I had to do a Google search to figure out what exactly you were talking about, Jonathan. But apparently taphole clay, it's a special engineered material they use to plug the taphole of a blast furnace. So that's like when they are, smeltering metal like aluminum or steel or whatever, they have the big crucible or whatever that they're heating that up in. And then when they're done, they pour it out, right? And so that while they're heating it, they don't want the material to flow out of it. So they have a plug, and that's what they use that taphole clay for. And really, it's, again, an engineered material. So it's not something they just dig out of the ground and use to plug that hole. What apparently it is made of or consists of clay, coke, pitch, oil, alumina, resin, and then abrasive material like silicon nitride. So it sounds like the clay that you have on your land is maybe part of that that's conducive for engineering or manufacturing taphole clay. That sounds like a more traditional mining type of a prospect. And in those types of situations, I think you're on the right track in terms of delineating or understanding the extent of that resource. And that would be drilling and looking at core samples and having a geologist take a look at that. And then from that information, they could help put together an estimate of the resource potential. So in other words, how much clay is there that could be mined, and how deep it is, and hopefully it's easy to get to, and things like that you could use as a sales pitch to help attract a company that would want to lease those rights or purchase that. I would imagine would be maybe the route they would go. And I've worked on a couple of mining adjacent projects when I was working in the oil and gas industry. And we worked with a consultant that does a lot of mining stuff. And he had a molybdenum mine in Colorado that he was doing a similar thing, which you're talking about. He owned the rights. He was working with geologists trying to put together the pitch deck, so to speak, to go out and try to attract investors. In Alabama, maybe it's easier than Colorado with the environmental and also being clay versus, a heavy metal type of a situation. But, that's probably the other thing that you talk about getting city approvals. There's probably some environmental approvals that need to happen, environmental reviews, things like that. Logistics would be a big part of it. All of that sounds like a very expensive project, but I think, I suppose if you're determined enough, you could assemble the team of experts to help you get that done. And certainly a geologist might be the first step to just get an understanding. Is this actually like a legitimate resource that somebody would be willing to develop, or is it uneconomic? And so they could probably save you a lot of time and effort before you did those other things. But that'd be my thoughts. I know when I help clients market mineral rights, I put together a marketing presentation that highlights the potential of the property. And that's things like, all the legal descriptions of the land, maps that show where it's located relative to oil and gas wells, and then highlighting the really good performing wells in the area. So we kind of put our best foot forward and saying, hey, these are really, here's the first month initial production rate, the maximum rate, or here's the cumulative production since when these wells started producing, and put geologic information in there, like the stratigraphic column showing all the different layers and different target formations and how many wells per section and things like that you want to sort of talk up the prospect so that somebody that is looking at that says, oh, that's interesting. There's a lot of potential there. I want to dig a little bit deeper. So I would think coming up with similar type of sales presentation would be helpful in just trying to get interest in your property. But yeah, certainly get help from somebody that knows mining and a geologist, and potentially partner with that person to help do that. Somebody that's done it before can help you navigate all those steps, because it is complicated and also a lengthy process, in my understanding. So good luck.
I think you said it with the team of experts, Matt, and somebody in the situation, if it was oil and gas related, would say, hey, find a good team of experts that can help you in the different aspects. And though it's different experts, I think the concept is the same. Having some folks around you that have some industry experience could probably, even without putting too much money into it, give you some idea of what you're working with, what it might cost, and really get your foot moving forward. All right. So our next one here is from Philip. Philip says, I've enjoyed learning from your experience. My family and I are working on a project in Atlanta. We've entered into an area where our knowledge is fuzzy. Do you do consulting? Philip, the answer is yes, Matt does do consulting, both one-on-one to investors and then also to mineral owners, whether it's an evaluation or just helping to understand your acreage.
Yeah, thank you for the sales pitch. I appreciate it. I do consulting. I'm happy to help, and I believe we had spoken. So Philip had reached out and we connected in a free consultation call. So I offer a free 30-minute consultation for all prospective clients, to understand, your situation, what you need help with, and to help you understand if I could help or help direct you in the right direction. So, I put that in there just because it's a common question. I do help, I have that consulting practice as well. So I wanted to throw that out there. If anybody, needs to go deeper than what we can cover in a podcast episode and they need some very specific help or have questions that are beyond that, I'm happy to help as well. So you can find out more about that. I'll link in the show notes to my company's website, and there's a link on the website where you can schedule that 30-minute call. And it's my website is silverheelsinvestments.com.
And a funny mention here that I've said a lot lately, it seems like actually, is that I met Matt through a cold call trying to find out about my minerals. And that was 8 years ago, that just a cold call to Matt. He was wonderful, took the time to explain what I was dealing with and get me on the path of learning. And then the rest is history. All right. So Sonia says, I was left an interest in 4 wells in Katy Parish, Louisiana. I want to sell the mineral rights. How do I find out what they're worth? And Matt, I'll let you talk about how to find out what they're worth. But Sonia, something to mention, you can sell part. You don't have to sell it all. You can sell a couple wells. You can sell them all. You could sell a piece of it. So do know that as you go into it, Sonia. Yeah,
that's a great tip. I think that is something that's little known a lot of times when people are first getting into this. But in general, Sonia, the value of minerals is based on the future revenue generating potential. And if you have minerals that have 4 producing wells on it, and if there is room for additional wells, maybe there's some additional value from that undeveloped acreage, so to speak. But in general, for like producing wells, you look at what they're going to produce in the future, what are commodity prices likely to do in the future, and then you calculate that together along with your decimal interest in those wells, and that is a certain royalty amount that you would receive in the future. You take all of those future cash flows, you discount them or you multiply them at a certain interest rate based on just time value of money calculation, and then you figure out what that lump sum is in today's dollars. And that's basically the extent of a valuation or appraisal. I mean, it's simplifying it quite a bit, but that's essentially what it is. There is a proxy for value for very mature wells, that have been producing for more than 5 years. And if your minerals are fully developed and there are no additional wells that are likely to be drilled in the future, you can use a multiple of your current monthly royalties. Again, you got to use it with a grain of salt because it's only going to give you an approximation of that. But the kind of rule of thumb is between 36 and 60 times your monthly royalty payment is likely where that value would fall. Again, that does not put any value on any undeveloped mineral. So if you only have 4 wells and there's ability to drill more, let's say there's only half of that section or whatever has been developed and you have room for 4 additional wells. If you value the minerals based on just those 4 existing wells, you'll probably be significantly undervaluing it because there's potential for future wells to get drilled, and there's still, in this case, probably gas under the ground. I'm not exactly sure where Katy Parish is, assuming it's probably on the Haynesville, which is a dry gas play. But whatever it is, there oil or gas that could be under the ground still, and if you just use that multiple of cash flow for when there's future potential, then you'll be leaving a lot of money on the table. So I do valuations and appraisals. So if you need additional help, Sonia, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to take a look at it and give you an estimate for what it would cost to run the numbers.
Our next one here is from Renee. Renee says, I'm a mineral owner, want to purchase more royalty interest. Matt, this is a common thing, I think, especially when we as mineral owners have productive royalties. You think, wow, this is great. Let's have more of this. getting started in that can be a bit tricky. I think for an informed mineral owner, maybe the gap's a little shorter. But if you're just starting out, learning the basics. So Matt's Mineral Management Basics course, it's not just for mineral owners, great for investors who want to learn more about it. It all starts with learning the foundation, whether that's for an investing purpose or whether that's for managing your own properties. In investing, Matt, I would imagine, really due diligence is something that you're thinking about a lot more. If you're buying this property, you want to ensure that you're getting what you think you're purchasing, which with minerals isn't always an easy question to answer.
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer. And in fact, I just was on another podcast here recently. It was a land investing podcast, and talking about that concept that in surface land and buying a house and stuff, you get a title insurance policy. They're the ones, the title company runs title. Usually that title insurance policy says, yeah, here's, this person owns the land, you're good to go. And if any title defects show up later, you have an insurance policy. Well, with minerals, that, no title company will underwrite a mineral transaction or insure minerals just because the mineral title is so complex and very easy for things to pop up that cause issues in the future around title issues. So, something where you really need to understand what you're getting into, like Justin said, and that's really through performing a title search from patent to present to understand who owns what. And there's things along the way that you'll see in running title and searching those county records that indicate that somebody might own the minerals. But like Justin said, my mineral management basics course is actually it's really the steps you need to use as a mineral investor to screen different deals and to understand who owns the minerals. So if you need a real quick search on a legal description or understanding somebody by name, does this person still own the minerals or did they sell them? Maybe you find their name in a pooling agreement or something, or pooling order, or is listed as an interested party. You can go to the county records and see, do they still own it? Did they sell it? Are they leased? Are they unleased? And things like that. And those due diligence steps are the same. You follow the same process as if you were a mineral owner and searching your own property. In this case, you're just searching somebody else's property and looking on the State Oil and Gas Commission website for that property and, what wells are nearby and things like that. So, it's really those, if you understand those basic things, you can start to put the pieces together around where companies are going to drill next. And maybe that's where you want to go and try to purchase more minerals and how to identify those owners. And, it's again, searching the State Oil and Gas Commission documents for pooling orders and spacing orders where it lists those names, and then going into the county records and searching to make sure they actually still own those minerals. So yeah, same process. And we actually have, there's a lot to consider in investing, and we go through that in several episodes. We've talked about that before on things to think about. We have an episode where we interviewed a mineral investor and fellow Narrow member, Jarrett Kitch. So episode 126, 128, 160, and 200 are 4 episodes where we really talk specifically about investing. And we'll link to all those episodes in the show notes, so you don't have to take notes if you're out there walking the dog or whatever. We'll link to those, and so you can go find those later. But it's a great place to be if you already understand your minerals and know how to manage them. You're already a leg up on a lot of other people that are interested in investing in minerals, but just don't know anything about it yet. So good luck.
Yep, good luck. That foundation is certainly key. All right, Matt, our next one here is from Cindy. Cindy says, thank you for keeping me on your email list to receive your newsletters. She's interested in setting up a one-on-one coaching session and also considering joining the National Association of Royalty Owners. And the reason why is her husband had mineral rights interest in North Dakota, Texas, and New Mexico. He had producing leases and receiving royalty payments from North Dakota. We've been talking about transferring the deeds to either both our names or to our family trust. And sadly, her husband passed away earlier this year after an extended illness before they could do the transfer. So sorry, Cindy, for his passing. We did have a will drawn up to show that the surviving spouse would inherit assets and set up a power of attorney documents with myself as my husband's attorney, in fact, and my son as mine. However, the mineral deeds are still under his name alone. Since I can no longer draw up a deed transfer after my husband's death, I contacted a North Dakota oil and gas attorney and have been working with them in the past few months. They began probate proceedings and will be wrapping things up shortly and recording the deeds to my name. However, I've not done anything about the Texas and New Mexico minerals. I don't want to hire an attorney for those states, but I don't know what to do as I cannot legally lease or sell the minerals while still in my husband's name. Could you provide some advice regarding the situation? Matt, I think this sounds like a really complicated situation, but it's really something that a lot of people find themselves in this situation.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very common situation. And again, Cindy, my condolences on the loss of your husband. First, regarding Narrow, I highly encourage you to join Narrow. There's a ton of recorded webinars on different topics, and kind of perennially we cover estate planning and the different state and national conventions. And I think actually this year we're going to have an estate planning presentation at the national convention coming up here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in November. But you can use the code MR podcast and you can get $25 off an introductory membership. And we'll link in the show notes the link to the Narrow membership page where you can join. So it's basically brings it down to like a cup of coffee a month to join. So it's super affordable, really a good resource. But then regarding your dilemma on the New Mexico and Texas interests, unfortunately, I really don't know a way around it other than hiring an attorney to help you transfer those interests. Now, the good thing is you don't have to open a full probate in those additional steps and go through that full process over and over. Most states allow you to file ancillary probate or of a foreign will. In other words, a will that was admitted to probate in another state. So once you've completed probate and gotten the interest transferred in North Dakota, you can take that North Dakota probate and submit it to Texas and New Mexico. And it's a much quicker and more straightforward process. And your attorney can help file the right paperwork to get that done. But it's basically I would say like 80% of the way there once you have that full probate done. And then it's just a matter of recording it in those counties where those other minerals are located to show that you have the authority to convey those interests in the other states. And that's really required to get marketable title to your late husband's interests, unfortunately. So not really aware of any way around this if you hadn't already transferred the interest to a trust or an LLC. So all that would have had been done before your husband's passing in order to avoid probate in those other states. And so I guess this is another reason, if you do have minerals in multiple states, it's a good idea to get with your attorney to figure out the most efficient way to manage those and to be able to avoid having to go through probate, because it's expensive to go through probate and then, time consuming. And there are ways around it to, again, put those in a trust is a great example of that, where if it had been in the family trust, then that trust document would dictate who gets what, in different events. And so that would be rather than probate, that would be required to convey those interests or really determine who's the beneficiary of those interests. But again, if you need any additional help, feel free to reach out. Happy to help you with anything you need around valuations or appraisals. If you have a state tax, or step up in basis that you want to establish from selling those to help minimize capital gains taxes, that's something to consider as well, depending on which route you go. So, well, good luck again, and hopefully, by the time you're listening to this, you were able to get the North Dakota stuff squared away, and then using that to get Texas and New Mexico minerals transferred to your name as well.
And Cindy, the upside is you have a chance to get this all together to save your heirs from going through this, and your education that you receive at Narrow, and working with others. Ask questions. Keep asking the questions till you understand the answer. But you have a good chance here to help your heirs out.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks again for listening. That was the last question for this month. Thanks again for everybody that submitted a question. If you have a question you'd like us to answer, you can send it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com, and we'll answer it on the air in the future episode. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.